Welcome to the Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast, hosted by William Wolfe. Our mission is to cultivate courageous and biblical Baptist leadership for the 21st century. We aim to revitalize the Southern Baptist Convention from within, defend it from those who seek its destruction, and serve as a better Baptist voice in the public square.
Welcome back to the Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, William Wolfe. As you know, the Center for Baptist Leadership exists to cultivate courageous and uncompromising Baptist leadership for the 21st century. I'm very pleased to be joined today by somebody who I think I can call a personal friend and who I think is a brother as a Christian in the public square, who is a role model for many Christians everywhere. Welcome to the show, Troy Miller, President and CEO of the National Religious Broadcasters. How are you doing today, Troy?
I'm doing great, William. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, Troy, I know that you are a Baptist. That's correct, right?
That's right. I'm a Baptist at Green Hill Church in Mount Juliet, Tennessee.
All right, from Tennessee. That's a Baptist stronghold. Well, thank you for joining us. Troy, tell us a little bit about how long you've been leading the NRB. And for those who might not know, what is the NRB and what do y'all do?
Yeah, so I've been involved with the NRB for over 20 years. I've been leading it as both its interim CEO and then in 2022, its permanent CEO for the last 5 years. So NRB is an organization. We just celebrated our 80th anniversary. NRB was started back in 1944 when radio was the number one medium out there. And there was a group of pastors that looked at this medium and said, this is a great way to communicate the gospel and to disciple people and to build up the church. But guess what? There was a group out there that they wanted to decide who could be and who could not be on radio and be in the public sector. So the group of pastors who are already on radio got together at Moody Church in Chicago and formed the National Religious Broadcasters Association to fight on behalf of Christian communicators to have their rights, to have their voice in the public sector. And that's what we do. That's what NRB has been doing for 80 years. But we've expanded far beyond radio. Now we have television, of course, and then today in this digital world, we have streamers and podcasters and bloggers, and we also have a lot of the folks in the Christian publishing industry, and of course, our wonderful folks that are Christian filmmakers.
Well, that's quite expansive. So it's interesting for me to hear, we hear a lot about how evangelicals are being pushed out of the public square today. And we see some very obvious examples of that. But even 80 years ago, Christian broadcasters, pastors who wanted to get the gospel message out on the air had to fight for their rights to do that. Is that correct?
That's right. They had to do that. There was a group that really wanted to marginalize them into what we would call just simple, short public service announcements, decide whether or not they could do any fundraising, and then even decide whether or not they were quote unquote worthy to be on radio. And so we thought that was a direct violation of their First Amendment rights. And NRB was formed, and not too long after it was formed, ABC Radio and a number of the radio stations back then, the big radio groups changed all of their policies, and that really launched Christian broadcasting.
Well, that's fantastic. And so you've been leading the organization for 5 years now. What has that been like for you? What are some of the challenges that you faced as the president, the CEO of the largest Christian broadcasting organization in the world? Certainly, we live in a very rapidly changing political and media environment. So what's that been like for you? What are some of the challenges you faced, and what are some of the successes you feel like you've had?
Yeah, and you're right. We've had a lot of challenges, and we do have a lot of challenges in our society today, especially against Christian communicators on all levels. And so one of the first things NRB had come out of just a kind of a period where it may have lost its way a little bit. And what we worked on hard was getting NRB back to its core mission. And that was advocating for Christian communicators in the halls of Congress, making sure we're watching all the pieces of legislation that are going through, so that there's nothing in there. They sneak something in there that would be an impediment to Christian broadcasting. Regulators and the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Federal Trade Commission are always changing rules. So we keep track of those and the things that are going on there. So we had to kind of really come together and build NRB up from the ground a little bit. But one of the things I'm really happy about is our annual conference, which is how we communicate to a lot of communicators. We've almost doubled that in the 5 years that I've been here. And so we focus very heavily on two things. One, advocating for Christian communicators in the governmental, in the legal spaces, and in the corporate and media spaces. And two, really fostering excellence in communications. And that's what we try to do on a daily basis.
That's great. Well, Troy, I had a chance to come to your annual conference. Actually, it was earlier this year. It feels like it was already last year, the way things have been in Tennessee at the Gaylord, and it was fantastic. So I could not recommend it more. I know you'll have another conference coming up here early next year. That's in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Is that correct?
That's right. Dallas, it's in the Grapevine area at the Gaylord Texan, so just north of DWF Airport there.
Great. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the show. But one of the things I remember you mentioning at the annual conference this year is that the NRB extended an invitation to all the presidential candidates to join and to address this large gathering of Christian broadcasters. But there was only one candidate who came, and who was that?
Well, and that was former President Trump. Look, we really had hoped. We put out invitations to the current president and to Ambassador Haley. They were the three top candidates at the time. We had really hoped that they would come in and, address this group of Christian broadcasters, Christian communicators on the issues that are important to us. But we never heard back from the White House, and the ambassador declined. And so former President Trump was the only one that took this up, and he came and spoke to our nearly over 2,000 people in that audience.
Well, yeah, I was there for it. I thought it was a great speech. I thought that former President Trump expressed a clear understanding of the concerns facing not just your average evangelical Christian, although that's certainly important, but particularly Christians involved in the broadcasting or the media production industry. Concerns centering around things like our freedom of speech and our freedom of religion, two constitutional rights, together there in the First Amendment that go hand in hand. And that brings me to one of the things I really want to get into with you here today, which is an excellent opinion editorial that you recently had published at the Daily Caller, titled "It's Time to Get Millions of Evangelical Voters to the Polls." And the piece is fantastic. We'll put it in the show notes. I highly recommend it. And we'll dive into some of the meat of the article there. But Troy, what inspired you to write that piece here just recently?
Well, the biggest thing that inspired me to work on that was the fact that this Pew report, or this Barna report, came across, and it really talked about the number of evangelicals who are not involved, who didn't vote and didn't get involved in the political process. And the second part of that, which was even more shocking, was that nearly half of evangelicals aren't even aware what the current issues are facing us in our culture today. And that was really shocking to me. That it's one thing not to get out there and vote. We can talk about all the things behind that, but it's another thing not to be aware, not to keep yourself informed on the key issues that affect us as Christians as we live and walk out our faith in daily life.
Yeah, you had a phrase in there that I think you said that too many Christians are both tuned out and they're not going to turn out. But really, there's a connection there, I think, between information, awareness, and action, right? One phrase that we use with our work at the Center for Baptist Leadership is we desire to educate, equip, and activate Southern Baptists, right? To take action. So, but in order to take action, you have to know what you're taking action on. And you raise one of those concerns here in the article. And let me read this for you here, because you quote the current vice presidential candidate for the Democratic ticket, Governor Tim Walz, where he said, "There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy." And you say that that is a totally inaccurate rendering of what the First Amendment does and does not protect. Unpack that for us.
Right. And the first thing you have to look at that is who gets to decide what is misinformation and what is hate speech. This current administration has weaponized the Justice Department and its own staff working in collusion with social media companies to decide what is disinformation, what information should go out and shouldn't go out. Where did they suddenly become the arbiters of information? That was exactly what the First Amendment was meant to prevent, that the government didn't become the arbiter of information unless that information was very, very specifically harmful to people. And the Supreme Court has ruled on this multiple times. That's not just a broad general harm. That has to be a very specific call to physical harm to somebody. Otherwise, the government should not be involved in deciding what is legal speech and what is not legal speech. And so here we have the potential vice president, and he just puts it right out there and says, we want to decide, we as the government are going to decide what is harmful and what is not harmful. So what does that mean? Is Christianity suddenly harmful because Jesus Christ claims to be the only way to heaven, to salvation? So is that suddenly harmful? And William, look, we've already seen this around the world. Our friends up in Canada, our broadcasters friends in Canada, they have to submit to the equivalent of the Federal Communications Commission in Canada. They have to submit their television programming at least 2 weeks in advance. So the commission can say, you can talk about that, but you can't talk about this. You can't preach in Canada from Romans 1. You can't preach from Leviticus. You can't address the issues that marriage is between a man and a woman. You can't say there are only two genders. You can't say that God is displeased with the sexual perversion that goes on in our culture. And if that's done, you'll get kicked off of television or radio in Canada. That's not far behind here when the statements like a potential vice president makes, like the one you just read.
Yeah, well, I've said this before. I actually said it on my last podcast, but I'll say it again for our listeners. And that's, if you want a picture of what the future of our freedoms in the United States might look like and how they might be eroded, look to California, then look to Canada, and then look to China, because that's the progression we're headed. And I did not know that about Canada. Actually, it doesn't surprise me at all that they have to get their broadcast approved 2 weeks in advance. When, if you think about it, there's really no difference between the government approving a broadcast and government propaganda when it comes down to it. If you're only saying what the government says you're free to say, it's essentially government sponsored propaganda. And so that's a startling question. It makes me think that, disinformation could be the exclusivity of Jesus Christ, and hate speech could be the exclusivity of man-woman marriage. You slap those two labels on, and Christian broadcasters across America will get shut down.
That's exactly right. Look, we know as evangelical Christians, we fought this battle once already in the 1500s when there was a church in Rome that said you could say this and you couldn't say this. And that was when Martin Luther went in front of the conference there, when he went in front of that council that was asking him. That's why Martin Luther made that famous statement about he needed to be able to follow his conscience. Okay. And this is a government that would like us to not follow our conscience or tell us what our conscience really is. And so that's neither, as he put it, that's neither right nor helpful for us as individual Christians. That is a freedom that our founding fathers enshrined in that First Amendment. We have the right of the freedom of religion and the fair and the free exercise thereof, not of exercising any religion that the government wants to come in and tell you how your religion works or what you believe or don't believe. And so that is just a really scary thought in this country right now.
Yeah, I agree. And it's particularly dystopian when you consider that our country really was founded on Christian values. Of course, the First Amendment does apply to other religions, and, with exceptions, and with, many people don't think Satanism sort of should be constitutionally protected. But whatever it does or doesn't apply to, it certainly applies to Christianity.
It does. It certainly applies to Christianity. And as you said, I think our founding fathers, the freedom of religion can apply to those religions here, because as Christians, of course, we wouldn't come out and support those, and we wouldn't be supporting those from our pulpits. But we know that we're not afraid of that, because as our founding fathers knew, Christianity can stand toe to toe with any religion around the world and will always come out on top. And so the founding fathers knew that. So some people ask, why didn't they say, freedom for Christianity or Christian nation? Because they knew that, and they knew that the power of the gospel message out there, and they were never afraid of that. And it's amazing to me how some Christians, even today, take this false understanding and back off and say, oh, we can't do that. We're going to offend somebody. That was never the purpose of the First Amendment. The purpose of the First Amendment was to enshrine the freedoms that we had, and they understood that those came from the Bible and they came from our Creator. They were enshrined in the Constitution, but they came from our Creator. They didn't come from government.
That's exactly right. So we're analyzing the threat here, which, some people sometimes tell me I'm blowing it out of proportion. Who's William Wolfe at the Center for Baptist Leadership, or who's William Wolfe on Twitter to tell people that our freedom of speech and our freedom of religion is under attack. But when we look at these comments from Governor Tim Walz, current vice presidential candidate, when we see the admission of our major social media outlets, Facebook and others, that they censored information per the government's request. And then when we see videos like Kamala Harris saying she'd be happy to shut down Elon Musk and X, and when we consider this history you've laid out for us for how Christian broadcasters have had to fight for the right to exercise their freedom of religion and freedom of speech, Troy, as the president of the largest Christian broadcasting organization in the world, it sounds like you're seeing these threats too.
Oh, absolutely, William. Look, and you've only touched the surface on them. As you said, you look at the Twitter files, and thank goodness for Elon Musk, who dumped all that information to see how often the government and these social media companies were just working hand in hand, making sure that there were stories that were absolutely killed. There were other stories that had community notes put on them so that people would take them into doubt. And of course, with COVID, there were stories that people couldn't even talk. These are people, career doctors, career scientists, couldn't even talk about with the way they felt and what they saw happening with the whole COVID thing, because the government came in and told these social media companies to silence them. We also have, let me give you a few other examples that went on over this last administration to tell you about how this, as we call it, this weaponization of government has done, and how it seeks to silence people. So our friends over at the Newsmax had gotten into a distribution dispute with the people at DirecTV. There was actually a letter written by the acting chairperson of the Commerce Committee, Commerce and Energy in the House, wrote a letter to all of the major cable distribution companies saying, we want to know why you're carrying all these conservative news networks, and you need to tell us, Congress, why you're doing that, and whether or not you're going to renew their contracts. And if you do that, renew their contracts, you need to answer to us for doing that. So that's the government just blowing past their authority and under the First Amendment, and authority under even the Communications Act, where the government is prohibited from getting involved in content that's carried by these organizations unless that content is profane in some way. So this is a government that just blew right through that roadblock, didn't even stop, didn't even look back. And that went on from there. So we get the Dobbs decision, right? We're as Christians, we're happy. The Dobbs decision, Roe v. Wade is no longer the bogus law of the land, right? And so what does a member of Congress do? They write to Google and tell Google, because all of a sudden all of these people are searching and they're finding crisis pregnancy centers out there. And this now irritates the pro-murder group. I don't call them pro-choice, the pro-murder group. they get a member of Congress and several members of Congress to write a letter to Google. Okay, and you can go out and find these on the NRB's website. You can go out. They write a letter to Google to tell Google to change their search engine algorithm, so that if you search for a crisis pregnancy or you search about pregnancy, that the first things you're going to get back is Planned Parenthood returns. You're going to get information on an abortion and Planned Parenthood and these other organizations, and that they shouldn't see any information on crisis pregnancy centers, because that's misleading. And that's what they called it. They did that because they said that crisis pregnancy centers were putting out disinformation on women's rights. That's how this plays out in real time.
Yeah, well, I did not know that story, though I am aware. I've seen the increasing attacks on crisis pregnancy centers from Elizabeth Warren and others, which is just, it's truly barbaric. It's a complete inversion of the truth. Crisis pregnancy centers are the ones that actually help care for mothers when they experience unplanned pregnancies and they need a hand, and they offer them a solution other than killing their unborn baby. Well, so this is the threats that we're facing, but what's the solution? And that's kind of what you get into a little bit in your article. This is fascinating to me. You say that that in the evangelical voting bloc, that 7 million evangelicals sat out the 2020 election potentially. And of course, as we're heading into the 2024 election, we have these same questions. How are evangelicals going to show up and vote? And you're saying it's time to get out there. Make that case for us today.
Right, William. That was 7 million evangelicals that set out the election in the key swing states that decided the election. 7 million. Had just a fraction of them got out and voted their values, I think we would have seen an entirely different set of results. And we would also have seen races that weren't even close. And so 37% of evangelicals as a whole have set on the sidelines and let the country go into the direction it's been going. And that's, if we step back for a second as just people, as Christians, if we just step back from the politics for a second and look at the direction that the country's going in. You know, I've been around this battle for a long time, and who would have thought that we would be fighting, back in the 80s, we would just be fighting, the plain fact of homosexuality. And then we had to fight for marriage between a man and a woman. And then it was 20 years before that was struck down, in 2015. And then less than 10 years, now what are we fighting for? That we have this LGBTQ community that doesn't mutilate middle schoolers and elementary kids. And that's how bad the slippery slope is, and that's how bad our society has gone. Think about it for a second. If Christians over that time period would have voted their values and would have voted their beliefs, because I think we can pretty much say that the majority of real evangelical Christians, they are pro-life. They are for women and men getting married. They are for, there are only two genders. They are for protecting education around those. So just think if those people would have been involved, the projection and the path the country might be on today. Also, there are just a number of issues. We're not just single issue voters. We're not just pro-life. We care about the family. We care about the economy. You care about what's going on at the border, because we care about people, and people are being exploited in this open border. So we care about all those things. But in that study as well, William, nearly half of Christians, 40% of Christians, 47% of Christians don't even keep up on the current issues from today. And I'll tell you where I lay the problem with this. The number one place I'm going to put the problem with this is the pulpits of America. That is the number one place, because we've had too many pastors who have been shamed into this idea that somehow politics is offline for them to preach about from their pulpit. And why is politics offline. When you look at the founding of this country, it was the Black Robed Regiment that got up and preached about the freedoms and the tyranny that was going on. It was that group that fired this country up and got people started on the road to independence. And they did that out of, I think, at least in my opinion, out of a real understanding of their responsibilities as pastors to shepherd people well. Not to be popular, not to be going with the flow of whatever society's going with, but to shepherd pastors on the full counsel of the Bible and the full counsel of the gospel. And that is sorely needed in our country today.
Well, I couldn't agree more with you. And I certainly have a lot of my own opinions on what's happened. Why have evangelical pastors, Christian pastors of all denominational backgrounds, really sort of let their mouths be silenced when it comes to applying the full counsel of God's word to every area of our lives. I do think there's a sort of dualistic pietism that exists where they believe that they can only address spiritual issues, and to get into what matters in our earthly lives is sort of off limits unless it's sort of a direct application of Christian discipleship, or welcome the stranger, things like that. They don't mind preaching on that. But I'll tell you that, you're a father. I have 3 young boys, and what happens in this life matters. And I want to hear from my pastors too, how we need to think about that. What about you, Troy? You've been around longer than I have. So what has led Christian pastors in America to either fall silent on these issues, or, as we've learned more and more, particularly through a book like Megan Basham's Shepherds for Sale, parrot the progressive agenda on politics?
And I think, look, then that is a great book, and everybody should read that book. If you haven't read that book yet, you need to read that book. And I think she really touched on a couple of things in there that I've been talking about for a long time. There are 2 movements within the pastorate that I think really have led to this. The first one is this whole idea of the seeker-friendly church, where the church has really gotten itself out of balance for what its purpose is. The Great Commission calls us, yes, to go out, to bring the gospel to all the nations, but it also tells us to teach people all that I have commanded you. The discipleship, the church's role, the pastor's role, the shepherd's role is to be discipling people, to be letting people know, how do we live out this life until the day comes when either God calls us home or Christ returns? How do we live this out? The New Testament is full of that, with the apostles talking to us and the writers talking to us. How do we navigate ourselves through this world today? Because we live in a world that doesn't, quite frankly, is never going to really accept us, right? The world is never going to accept us. And so this whole seeker-friendly movement has balanced the church to the seeker that's in the pew. We're so afraid that we're going to upset somebody who is, quote unquote, seeking Christ and the gospel, that we've left behind the people who have already given their lives and their hearts to Christ. And we give them this kind of milquetoast, watered down gospel teaching because of all those seekers that might be in our pews. And guess what? We come up with a very milquetoast, lukewarm church. Even the father of this said, it didn't do what I thought it was going to do. It didn't fill the church full of disciples. It just filled the church full of fans.
Who was that,
the
Troy?
Gospel. That was Bill Hybels, who was the father of the seeker-friendly movement. He actually wrote a letter, denouncing his own movement that he started. And so that's one thing. But I think the other thing in the modern pastorate that's moved into is this idea of what I call the CEO pastor. Okay, so the pastors that have come into now, they've come into the pastorhood because it's an occupation. Okay, it's not a calling for them. Okay, it's an occupation, and they've come out and they've had these seeker-driven principles given to them, and so they look at their churches like a CEO looks at them. The people in their audience are consumers, and then they look at the trends that are going on there, and we see the younger generation is more LGBTQ friendly. We better not talk about the LGBTQ community, or we might alienate those young people that come to our church. Or guess what? There's a generation today, they don't quite see abortion or pro-life movement starting at conception. They see it starting later. So we should compromise and damp down that topic. And this has happened with topics over and over again. They see immigration as a key issue. Well, we're supposed to speak truth into them. We're not supposed to be shying away. We're supposed to be shepherd them into the truth, into the light. And I just don't see that happening because pastors today, they're worried about that CEO mentality.
Well, you heard it here from Troy, folks. His reasons for why the pastorate in America has gotten so milquetoast is because of the seeker-sensitive movement and the pastor as a CEO model. Troy, I think those are great criticisms to levy against the American pastorate. If you're a pastor and you're listening to this, I'd encourage you to analyze your ministry and consider in what ways are you falling into these dual traps of being a seeker-sensitive church to the neglect of discipling the congregation within you, including how they need to live their lives in the public square and in the political realm. And are you acting as a CEO instead of as a shepherd of God's church? Troy, as you move through your article that we're talking about here, you give a hat tip to the moral majority and sort of how they helped build this evangelical voting bloc. We live in a very interesting moment in American Christianity where I actually view much of what we call the young, restless, and reformed movement as sort of a subtle, intentional rebuke of the moral majority, particularly on the political realm. And that's sort of petering out now. I think there's a lot of lessons we could still learn from the moral majority, but you brought them into your article. Why was that?
Because I do think that they really were responsible back in the 80s for kind of solidifying this as a voting bloc. I think people looked at themselves in a more individual way before that, but they started to see where the culture was going and where the culture was shifting. And they just really reminded people that it is our Christian responsibility to be involved, to be active in the culture. We think about it this way. Because today we have all of these negative terms and these kind of terms that they're meant to shame us Christians out of the public sector, so Christian nationalism, really was put on us as a term to shame us. But think about it this way. We are voting for the right to vote in this country. We are voting for the people that are going to govern over us. All the way from the top in Washington, D.C. at the White House, all the way down to the school boards that are making decisions in our local communities, the people that are going to govern over us. That is what our vote is about. Our vote isn't some personal political message. It isn't a virtual signaling to other people about who we are. It is us deciding who the people will be that make the policies, that spend the money, that advance the legislation, that tell us how the regulations and rules work. That's who we're voting for. It's the people that are going to do those things. So this whole idea that somehow Christianity are the only people, Christians are the only people that aren't allowed to be a part of that process, that aren't allowed to take their beliefs, their morality, their ethics, their faith into that process is crazy. Because guess what, William? Every other group is bringing their faith, their morality or lack of morality, their kind of ethics, their view of policies in this country. They're bringing those into there, and you don't see anybody running around and go, "Oh, those LGBTQ nationalists! They're a danger to our country." They need to go away. You don't hear that anywhere else, and often I don't think Christians think that through enough. They don't think through enough that, wait, hold on a second. Why can't I as a Christian? Why shouldn't I as a Christian be involved in this process? I have a right to do that, just like everyone else. Don't let anybody shame you. And I think groups like the Moral Majority and those really brought that to the forefront. And groups like you said, the new Reformation movement, the young guys that thought they were doing good just talking about the Bible. Well, all you have to do is look around you, and where is society gone today?
Yeah, well said. I've heard some criticisms that it's somehow inappropriate for, say, Southern Baptists to view themselves as a political bloc. But that just rings hollow to me, because Southern Baptists, of course, the purpose of the Southern Baptist Convention is to take the gospel to the nations. But there are 13, 14 million Southern Baptists in the United States of America. And it's not inappropriate for us to be able to recognize that we have a spiritual mission that we execute through the church and through the IMB and through NAM. And then we also live lives here in America. And because we all call ourselves Southern Baptists, we sort of have a shared identity and shared set of concerns and interests that we also share broadly with many other Christians. And actually, I think it's this effort to get Christians out of the public square that some Christians have bought into that causes them to wag their fingers at Southern Baptists having a self-identified political interest in our country. What do you have to say to that?
Well, look, wow, that's exactly right. Why? Look, we both of us are Southern Baptists. Why can't the Southern Baptists as a group? And that's where the word, we throw the word politics in there, because politics is viewed as this so negative, this very negative thing. But why not as a group? Why, again, I go back to this. Why can't the Southern Baptists, as a group of individuals who already hold to a common set of values, a common set of beliefs, we hold to a common set of goals for the most part, right? Why do we not hold to a common sense of how this country should be governed, how this country should be managed, how this country should oversee the resources that a lot of us give to this country? Why is that suddenly wrong? So what we're saying is we want to have all this kind of spiritual, influence on our own, but we're going to step out of all the institutes that really guide the country. We're going to step out and say, and because it always gets pushed up to the presidency, but what we're really saying is we're going to step out how the school boards decide how kids are educated today. Christians started public education. Public education wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the church, because Christians were the one that pushed that everybody should be educated, not just people that were elitist out there. Everybody should be educated. So why would we step away from these institutions that were, most of them, founded by Christians, and say we're going to let pagans govern them? We're going to let atheists govern them. We're going to let, people who have an immoral view of what goes on in this country govern and make all those decisions. That, when you step back and think of it that way, it's crazy that any pastor would actually stand in the pulpit and tell you, we're going to let other people make the decisions of how your grandkids are going to be educated, how your great grandkids are going to be educated. And we have to remember, that's who we're passing this world on to. The scripture calls and tells us to pass on that righteous governance to our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren.
Yeah, Proverbs says that a wise man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. And that inheritance is certainly, it's spiritual, right? We want to train our children up to know and love the Lord, to believe the gospel. It's also material. We want to leave them, financial inheritance if possible, but it's also national. There's a national inheritance. And I think that actually ties into that command to do that, ties into the fifth commandment to honor our father and mother, honor those who have come before us here in the United States of America and given us this stewardship and this ability and these freedoms. I couldn't agree with you more. And if Southern Baptists do have that common vision, well, guess what? That makes them a voting bloc. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think of the Human Rights Campaign. I've asked this question before. Why does the Human Rights Campaign, which is this incredibly aggressive pro-LGBT lobby, and the LGBT community in the United States of America is actually a pretty small number, and the trans community even smaller, why can they bend corporations to their will and Southern Baptists can't? I want a Southern Baptist score out there, or an NRB score, whatever, that can make these organizations, these companies actually respect our will and our interests as consumers, as people in this country. And there's no reason why we can't. So I love your boldness here. And so, your article really kind of ends with a call to be involved, particularly with the election that we're that we're facing this year. It's high stakes. As I've said, it's not a normal election. I understand the NRB doesn't endorse candidates. The Center for Baptist Leadership doesn't endorse candidates. But you make a point in there about how maybe too many Christians get too concerned about a candidate sort of maybe personality versus their policies. I think that's something we've seen for 8 years. So what's your message to this major evangelical voting bloc in America as we're now less than 50 days out from the election?
Yeah, don't be look, and all of that goes back to that this whole idea of the personality of the candidate or that. A lot of that goes back to what, how the candidate's being smeared or shamed or how the candidate's being positioned. Look at what the candidate's done. We're in an election cycle where we actually have two candidates that we can see their past, history of what they've done and the kind of policies and the kinds of things they've implemented and believed in. And so but as Christians, I think we have to push back from this CEO pastorate, seeker-friendly pastorate, which really, at the end of the day, it creates a no-risk Christianity, okay? We have to be able to stand up for our values, stand up for what we believe in, and not be afraid that it might upset somebody. Why did Jesus tell us to bear our cross, to pick up our cross? Why did he tell us that he didn't come to bring peace? He came to bring, sometimes he said he came to bring animosity between a father and a son, a mother and a daughter, a mother and a daughter-in-law, and so on. Because he knew there was a time going to come where we had to stand up for the principles of the gospel, for the principles of scripture that we believe in. And so now is a time, if you want to hand off a country to your children and to your grandchildren, the legacy to have the freedoms that we have lived under, then now is not a time to cower or to be ashamed. Now is the time to get informed, look at the world through your Christian worldview lens, and then, as the Apostle James said, show your faith by action. Show your faith by action.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Troy. So in short, you need to tune in. You need to make yourself aware of what we're dealing with, and you need to turn out, particularly when it comes to that election. Now, Troy, the NRB is actually involved in a pretty important lawsuit that Christians should be aware of. The NRB has joined some other organizations and churches to seek to, overturn what's known as the Johnson Amendment. And that plays into how Christians have been silenced. And I recognize this is ongoing litigation, so you've got to speak at a high level, but give our listeners here a little bit of a background on what the Johnson Amendment is, how it came about, why many Christians like yourself view it being weaponized against Christians, and what you hope to achieve from that lawsuit.
Yeah, so we are suing the Internal Revenue Service based on a law that is known as the Johnson Amendment. The reason it's called the Johnson Amendment is because Lyndon J. Johnson, when he was running for Senate back in the 1950s, he was opposed by many churches across Texas because he was just considered to be corrupt, immoral, and the wrong person for the office. So many churches and pastors did speak out from the pulpit back in the 1950s and opposed his election. Well, he was elected to the Senate anyway, and what he did was he took this bill, this Johnson Amendment, he amended it, he attached it to another bill that was already voted on going through Congress, and he got this bill pushed through without any vote by Congress, by the way. No vote. He just got it attached to there, pushed through. And what this amendment did was it silenced the churches so that he wouldn't have to deal with their opposition anymore. And so there's three parts of it. The first part says that nonprofit organizations, as determined by the Internal Revenue Service, they can't donate to campaigns. The second part says they can't endorse or oppose candidates. And the third part limits the amount and kind of lobbying they can do. Okay. We're focused in on that second part about endorsing or opposing candidates because the IRS has really, first of all, we think this is a freedom that all 501c3 organizations, regardless of your position, conservative, progressive, left, right, it doesn't matter. All nonprofit organization should be able to speak out about candidates, whether supporting or opposing them. Okay. But the IRS has been so inconsistent in their enforcement of this over the years. So many left-leaning progressive churches have been able to speak out about candidates. They've never come in. They've never sent a letter to them. There are a number of nonprofit 501c3 newspapers that every year endorse a candidate. So why can't that be done from the pulpit? So this will open up and give pastors the freedoms they had in this country leading up to the mid 1950s. This is a freedom they had in this country until Lyndon B. Johnson said they couldn't do it anymore. That's wrong. We think the courts will agree with us. And by the way, it's not meant to affect this election. It's going to go through its cycle in the courts. This is a wrong that we see needs to be righted for everyone in this sector across the country.
Well, that's fantastic to hear. I've long thought that there are two major pieces of law out there that need to be overturned in our country, just me personally speaking, and that's the Johnson Amendment and the FACE Act, because those two in particular are being weaponized by the bureaucracy, which, so I had the privilege of serving in the first Trump administration of the State Department and DOD, and 90% of the federal bureaucracy are registered Democrats. We don't have many conservative friends when it comes to the people who hold the levers of power in Washington, D.C. And so we've seen the FACE Act weaponized against pro-lifers, and we've seen the Johnson Amendment arbitrarily enforced, usually against conservatives, while at the same time you could pick, quite frankly, just about any black church in America on any given weekend, and if they get a Democrat politician there, they're endorsing them. It really is. It's unfair. It's ridiculous, and we need to see those gone. I'm thankful that the NRB is leading the fight on that. Troy, this has been an incredibly helpful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Will you want to give some closing thoughts to our listeners and tell us a little bit more about the upcoming conference?
Yeah, look, first of all, we talk about a lot of things out there that seem pretty negative, but remember, we're Christians. We have the hope of the gospel. The scripture tells us the gates of hell won't stand against it. We just need to exercise our rights as Christians. Get out there, share your testimony, share your faith. Don't be afraid to talk about politics and faith with people in the market. We have an annual conference every year. This year, coming up in 2025, it will be in Grapevine, Texas, at the Gaylord Texan Hotel. It's the largest gathering of Christian communicators. If you've ever thought that God was calling you to a podcast or into to be a blogger, or just simply to communicate better over your own social media networks, or you work in Christian broadcasting today, this is where you need to come, network with your peers, learn about what's going on, both in the legal standpoint, in legislation, laws, and regulations, but also learn about what's going on in the culture and learn about all the new technologies that are out there. You can do all that in 4 days under one roof down in Grapevine, Texas. So go to nrb.org. You can find out about the conference, and you can also track all the issues that we're dealing with on behalf of Christian communicators across this country.
Well, that sounds fantastic, Troy. As a writer and now a podcaster and a pretty avid social media user, I'm going to make sure that I'm there. Look forward to joining you. And also, Troy, I don't know if you knew this, but I want to make sure to tell our listeners on this episode as well that the Center for Baptist Leadership is giving away for free 500 copies of that book that Troy, the president of the NRB, says you need to read, Shepherds for Sale. You can sign up on our website today to get your free copy. We'll ship it out to you at no cost, not for the book, not for the shipping. That's a gift that's been made possible by the generous support of one of our sponsors. So make sure to get your hands on that copy today. Troy, where can people also follow you personally on social media?
You can follow me on X, on NRB CEO. And again, you'll keep up with us and all that we're doing at NRB.
Gotcha. Well, Troy, thank you so much for your bold witness, your unapologetic and outspoken defense of our foundational freedoms here in the country, freedom of speech and freedom of religion in the First Amendment that does not come with an asterisk approved by the government or approved by the fact checkers. We're thankful for you, brother. Folks, make sure to follow Troy, the NRB, come to the conference, and we look forward to seeing you there, Troy.
Well, thank you, and keep up all the good work you're doing, William, at the center. It's very, very, very needed for us.
All right. God bless. Take care, brother.
The Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast is powered by American Reformer, hosted by William Wolfe, with audio production by Jared Cummings. Our music is a custom remix of Soldiers of Christ in Truth Arrayed, the official hymn of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. To help CBL reform and revitalize Christian institutions, please consider making a generous donation today at centerforbaptistleadership.org.